The Jim Crow crime no one talks about, refusing to clean for white folks. It was illegal for black women not to be housekeepers. It was a crime. This is the dark Jim Crow history that white people don't want you to know. They definitely don't teach this in school. We've seen the mammy roles, like Gone with the Wind, played by Hattie McDaniel. We've seen the mammy ads and products that were available during the Jim Crow era, like the Aunt Jemima pancake box. Well, the history goes a lot deeper than what they truly teach. Here is the dark truth. They really disenfranchised black women and continue to do so. There was a whole law during Jim Crow where they were forced to be housekeepers, also known as domestic workers, and if they refused, they were arrested, charged, labeled vagrants, locked up just for wanting something different than mopping someone else's floor. They didn't just force black women into domestic labor. When they resisted or simply existed outside white society's control, they were funneled into another system: prison.
I was jailed because I didn't want to be someone's maid.
You won't be surprised to know that before the Civil War, the number of black women in prison was nearly non-existent. But the moment slavery ended, incarceration numbers began to rise, fast. The system needed a new way to control and exploit black women, and it found one. Take Illinois. In the 1850s, 75% of female prisoners were foreign-born, mostly poor Irish immigrants. Black women made up only about 2% of the female prison population. But 5 years after slavery ended, that number jumped to 25% of all commitments. By the 1890s, black women made up 2/3 of the daily prison population in Illinois. 2/3. In Ohio, it was the same pattern. Between 1890 and 1930, the percentage of black women in state prison doubled from 26% to 52%, while black people only made up 2 to 3% of the state's total population. In Tennessee, things were even more blatant. By the late 19th century, over 70% of the women in the state penitentiary were black, even though black people were only 26% of Tennessee's population. This wasn't coincidence. This was retaliation. This was capitalism and racism doing what it always does, rebranding oppression to make it profitable. As scholar Nicole Hahn Rafter put it, Southern prisons were a form of labor exploitation as well as racial control. The states made money off black prisoners. They leased them out to private employers. They worked them, men and women alike, like mules. Long hours, hard labor, starvation rations, chain gangs, and no legal protection. Slavery was supposed to be over. But if you were black, and especially if you were a woman without proof of proper employment, they found a way to make sure you never stopped working. And don't think the North was much better. Rafter noted that while racism was less visible up north, the outcomes were just as brutal. Black women were hit with higher fines, longer sentences, and were more likely to be incarcerated than white women convicted of the exact same crimes. The prisons didn't need plantations, they had iron bars. Insert the name Laura Scott into that legacy. Her story is just one of many, but it matters. She was one of the women caught in that net, locked up, used, forgotten. Her photo tells the truth most textbooks still won't. They didn't need to own you to control you. They just needed a courthouse, a sheriff, and a lie. Scope News presents a truth they tried to erase: how black women's labor wasn't just expected, it was legally demanded. Let's take it back to the aftermath of slavery. When the South lost its free labor force, it didn't just lose black workers, it lost control. So it created new systems to force black people right back into servitude. For black men, that meant convict leasing. For black women, it meant domestic service under the threat of vagrancy laws. These laws were deliberately vague, criminalizing things like idleness or loitering. In practice, they were weapons used to arrest black women who weren't working for white families. The goal wasn't just to keep black women employed, it was to keep them in their place. If a black woman was caught walking to town, visiting a relative, or looking for a better job, and she didn't have a written note or documented proof, that she worked as a maid, cook, or washerwoman, she was at risk of arrest. And these arrests weren't just routine. They were part of a profitable cycle. Black women could be leased out to white households or county governments for pennies. Some were sentenced to hard labor. Others were sent to prison farms, where they picked cotton under armed guard. It was slavery in all but name. That's not freedom. That's legalized gendered slavery rebranded through Jim Crow law. These women weren't given the dignity of choice. In many cases, they were forced to accept abusive or dehumanizing conditions just to avoid being jailed. Some worked 12 to 14-hour days, slept in closets or on porches, and raised white children while their own were left behind or neglected out of necessity. And if you think this was about protecting the economy or public order, remember this: white women were not arrested for vagrancy. This law didn't apply to them. They were allowed to be homemakers, socialites, or simply unemployed without legal consequences. But a black woman without a job cleaning someone else's home? She was labeled a danger to society. Even during the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were unemployed, black women were still targeted under these laws. The system didn't care that jobs were scarce. It only cared that black women stayed in service roles. And that service came with no safety net. When Social Security was introduced in 1935, it excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers. At the time, those two job categories made up the vast majority of black employment in the South. This was not a coincidence. It was intentional. Lawmakers, many of whom represented Southern states, didn't want to give black people access to federal benefits. That meant no retirement, no unemployment insurance, no disability protection, no workers' compensation. Black women cleaned the homes of white families who had pensions while having nothing for themselves. They cooked food they couldn't afford to eat. They kept households running while their own fell apart. They were invisible but essential, and they were deliberately left out of the very systems they helped sustain. And it didn't stop at labor exclusion. Many of these women were subjected to abuse with no legal recourse. Harassment, assault, wage theft, it was all part of the job. Because if they spoke up, they could be fired, blacklisted, or worse, accused of being disrespectful, which could quickly escalate into an arrest or mob violence. Even when black women tried to organize for better conditions, they were met with violence and retaliation. Domestic worker unions were infiltrated. Strike leaders were arrested or threatened. And yet, these women kept pushing, quietly, fiercely, determined to carve out even a sliver of dignity from a system that tried to crush them. And here's the thing, these laws didn't disappear overnight. Some states kept vagrancy laws on the books into the 1970s. Even when they were repealed, their effects lingered. Employers still treated black women as second-class laborers. Welfare programs were weaponized against them, portraying them as lazy or undeserving. Meanwhile, the descendants of the same families who benefited from this domestic labor now dominate wealth and politics. The trauma didn't end when the laws changed. It passed down. You ever wonder why so many grandmothers, great aunts, and elder black women carry themselves with stoic silence? Why they keep their stories close to the chest? Because many of them lived through this. They remember. They were there. They saw their sisters arrested for trying to live life on their own terms. They worked for pennies. They endured slurs, abuse, and silence. And when they got old, they had no retirement fund, only memories of other people's homes they cleaned. Some even died still in uniform. And yet history forgot them. You don't hear their names in classrooms. There are no monuments for the black maid who survived 5 decades of labor just to be buried in a pauper's grave. No documentaries about the grandmother who kept house for 6 different white families, never took a vacation, and died without a pension. But they built this country. Their hands scrubbed the floors of American power. Their backs held up households while laws held them down. And the country called them lazy. Let's be clear, this was not about dignity of labor. This was about control. It was a crime for black women not to be maids. That's not just history. That's a generational wound, carried in silence, paid for in labor, and written in law. And still today, Black women continue to dominate the domestic labor industry, often underpaid, overworked, and unprotected. The legacy of these vagrancy laws lives on in how society still views Black women's work, their worth, and their place. But Scope News doesn't forget. We remember, we investigate, we say their names. She wasn't just someone's maid. She was a survivor of a law designed to keep her in chains. Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. This report draws from archival records, including the Mississippi Black Codes of 1865, Georgia criminal statutes, 1890-1950, and labor documentation preserved in the Southern Oral History Program. The exclusion of domestic workers from the Social Security Act of 1935 is confirmed by the U.S. Social Security Administration and research from the Urban Institute. Key historical analysis is based on the work of scholars like Tara W. Hunter, author of To Joy My Freedom, and Darlene Clark Hine, who has extensively documented Black women's labor under Jim Crow. Additional insights were drawn from primary accounts collected by the Federal Writers Project and interviews archived by the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Legal disclaimer: this Scope News report is presented for educational, informational, and historical purposes. Some content may be disturbing or triggering to viewers due to its honest portrayal of racism, systemic injustice, and violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Scope News makes every effort to reflect documented truth and cite historically accurate sources, but we acknowledge the limitations in archival access, oral histories, and erased narratives. This content is not intended to defame, incite, or target individuals, institutions, or groups, but rather to uplift suppressed histories and honor the voices too often left out. All media content, commentary, and language used are protected under applicable freedom of press and expression laws.